I was standing in our backyard in Tucson, 63 years old, watering the roses my husband had planted for me on our first anniversary, when I heard him laugh. Not a small laugh, not a quiet, polite sound. A full, open belly laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and unguarded. The kind I had never, in 4 years of marriage, heard from him before. I turned around, slowly. My husband was standing on the back porch, phone pressed to his ear, talking. Clearly, fluently, without any of the careful pauses, the written notes, the gentle gestures I had grown so used to. He was telling someone a story, and whoever was on the other end was laughing too. And my husband, the man I had rearranged my entire retirement for, the man I had given up my morning yoga classes, and my book club, and my Thursday lunches with my sister for, the man I had stayed home with day after day because he told me the world outside had become too much, was laughing like he hadn't a care in the world. He hadn't seen me yet. I stood there holding the garden hose, water running over my shoes, and I thought, I don't know this person. Let me go back to the beginning. Because you need to understand what I gave up to get here, and you need to understand why, for a long time, I didn't regret a single moment of it. I was 58 when I met my husband. Retired early from 30 years of teaching high school English in Phoenix, recently moved to Tucson to be closer to my younger sister after my first husband passed. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want to be honest about that. I was content. I had my garden and my books and my sister's family down the road, and I thought, this is enough. This is a good life. My daughter, she lives in Portland, works in healthcare, calls me every Sunday without fail. She was the one who suggested I try one of those apps. Not for dating, she said, just to meet people. Just to get out of your own head a little, Mom. You've been alone for 2 years. I made a profile mostly to satisfy her. I didn't think anything would come of it. His profile said he was 61, a retired civil engineer, widower, lived alone outside Tucson. His photo showed a lean man with silver hair and kind eyes, and a slight smile that looked like it cost him something to give. He had written very little about himself, just a few lines, something about preferring quiet mornings and long drives and being done with complicated things. I liked that. I had had enough complicated things too. We started messaging. He was thoughtful and slow to respond, and I appreciated that. No rushing, no performing. After about 2 weeks, he told me something that I imagine took some courage to write. He told me he had a condition. Progressive hearing loss, diagnosed 5 years prior. Now significant enough that phone calls were difficult and crowded places were disorienting and exhausting. He wore hearing aids, but they helped only so much. He communicated mostly through writing and lip reading, and when he was comfortable with someone, a little sign language. He said he understood if that changed things. I sat with that message for a long time. I thought about what it must have cost him to type it. I thought about how many times he had probably sent something like that and watched someone quietly disappear. And I thought about my father, who had lost most of his hearing in his 70s and spent the last years of his life feeling cut off from everyone he loved. I had watched what loneliness like that does to a person. I wrote back, "It doesn't change anything. Tell me what helps, and I'll do that." What followed was one of the most surprising years of my life. We met in person for the first time at a small cafe in Midtown Tucson. His suggestion, because it was quiet and had good lighting, he said, which I later understood meant he could read lips more easily. He was exactly as his photo suggested. Calm, considered. He listened in a way that most people don't, fully, without waiting for his turn to speak. I thought at the time that his hearing loss had perhaps taught him that when communication takes effort, you stop wasting it. We saw each other every week, then twice a week. I learned quickly that the most respectful thing I could do was face him when I spoke, speak clearly without exaggerating, and not get frustrated when he asked me to repeat something. I downloaded an app on my phone so I could type quickly when background noise made lip reading hard. I started taking a beginner ASL class at the community center on Tuesday mornings. I told my daughter about it, and she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mom, that's really something." I didn't think of it as sacrifice. I want to say that clearly. I did those things because I wanted to, because he was worth the effort, because learning how someone needs to be loved and then doing it, that is just love. That's all that it is. We got married 18 months after we met. Small ceremony, just family and a few close friends, in the backyard of his house. The house that would become our house. My daughter flew down from Portland. My sister cried through the whole thing. My husband held my hands and looked at me the way people talk about when they say they found the right person at the right time, and I believed every word of it. I moved in. I gave up my rental. I unpacked my books onto his shelves and planted roses along the back fence and thought, this is the chapter I didn't know I was waiting for. The first year was genuinely good. Quiet, yes. We stayed home more than I might have on my own. He found large gatherings draining and unpredictable, and I understood that hearing aids in noisy environments apparently make everything louder without making anything clearer, which sounds like its own particular kind of torment. We declined some invitations. We spent a lot of evenings reading side by side, or watching films with captions, or sitting in the backyard after dinner while the desert cooled down around us. My sister asked once, gently, whether I felt isolated. I told her honestly that I didn't, that I had spent 30 years in loud classrooms and louder staff meetings, and I had earned the right to some quiet. But somewhere in the second year, things began to shift in ways I couldn't quite name. He started taking longer drives on his own. He said he needed the solitude, that even comfortable companionship could wear on him when the hearing aids were in all day. I understood that too, or I told myself I did. He bought a workshop in the garage and spent long hours out there, woodworking, he said, though I noticed he never seemed to produce much. When I knocked and came in, he would look up with something that took a half-second too long to settle into a smile. He stopped joining me at my sister's for Sunday dinners, citing headaches, fatigue, the drive. I stopped going as often myself because it felt strange to go alone, and because he seemed to need me there, and because I told myself that at this stage of life, a marriage asks for presence, and I was willing to give it. Looking back, I think I had begun, without realizing it, to make myself smaller in ways that had nothing to do with his hearing. The morning I found out, the morning of the garden hose and the laughter, was a Tuesday in October. I had come back from the grocery store earlier than expected. The backyard gate was open, and I went around the side of the house, and there he was, on the porch, phone to his ear, animated and easy and completely himself in a way I had never once witnessed. I stood there for what felt like a long time, long enough for the water to soak through my left shoe completely. He turned and saw me. What happened to his face in that moment is something I have replayed many times since. It was not guilt, exactly. It was something closer to a door closing. something becoming very careful, very quickly. He ended the call. We looked at each other across the yard, and then he said, in a voice that was clear and low and unhurried, "I think we need to talk." I set down the hose. I walked up the porch steps. I sat down in the chair across from him, and I folded my hands in my lap the way I used to when I was trying to model composure for a classroom full of teenagers, and I said, "I'm listening." What he told me over the next hour, I have had to sit with for a long time before I could speak about it without my voice going somewhere I don't want it to go. He said the hearing loss was real. It had been real. A diagnosis 5 years ago, genuine and documented. He had been frightened by it, more frightened than he had let on to anyone. His first wife had died after a long illness, and he had felt, he said, like he had already used up his portion of being taken care of. He didn't know how to need things from people. He had always managed on his own. But when we met, and when I responded the way I did, the ASL classes, the app on my phone, the patience, something in him panicked. Not the good kind of panic. The kind that comes from feeling like you don't deserve what you're being given. He had started treatment 18 months ago, a specialist in Phoenix, a combination of therapies, a new type of hearing aid he hadn't mentioned. His hearing had improved substantially, not fully. There was still loss, still limitation, but enough. Enough that the phone calls were manageable again. Enough that he could follow a conversation in a quiet room without reading lips. Enough that the accommodations I had been making, the typed notes, the positioning, the careful enunciation, were no longer strictly necessary. He hadn't told me because he didn't know how. That is what he said. He didn't know how to tell me that the thing I had organized my tenderness around had changed. He was afraid I would feel foolish for the ASL classes. He was afraid that without his need, I would realize I had less reason to stay. He was afraid, he said, of what I would see if I looked at him without the framework of taking care of him. I sat with all of that for a very long time. Then I said, "You let me give up my Thursday lunches with my sister for 2 years." He said, "Yes. You let me stop going to my book club. Yes. You let me build my entire daily life around a limitation you no longer had." He didn't say anything. He looked at his hands. I stood up. I went inside. I sat in the bedroom with the door closed for a long time, and I thought about my first husband who had been honest with me to a fault, sometimes brutally so, and how I had taken that for granted. I thought about my father going quiet at the end of his life. I thought about my daughter, who calls every Sunday, who would be calling in 4 days, and who I would have to decide what to tell. I thought about the roses along the back fence, which he had planted because I mentioned once that my mother had grown them. I didn't know what to do with someone who paid that kind of attention and told that kind of lies at the same time. I called my sister that evening. I told her most of it. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very carefully, "The thing that I think needed to be said. What do you want? Not what's right, not what's fair. What do you actually want?" I didn't have an answer that night. I asked my husband to stay in the guest room while I thought. He agreed without argument. He left a note under the bedroom door that night that said only, "I'm sorry. You deserved better than this from me. Whatever you decide, I understand." I kept the note. I don't entirely know why. My daughter called on Sunday. I told her everything. She was quiet in the way that meant she was thinking rather than reacting, which is one of the things I'm proudest of in her. Finally, she said, "Mom, do you think he told himself it wasn't that big a deal? That he was protecting you somehow? I said I thought that was probably part of it. I also thought that people who are afraid of being left will sometimes unconsciously create the conditions that make leaving harder. I had taught enough literature to recognize that architecture when I saw it. She asked if I was angry. I said, more sad than angry, which surprised me. She said that probably meant something. My husband and I began seeing a couples therapist, a woman in her 60s herself, which I had specifically requested, because I wanted someone who understood that rebuilding something at this stage of life is a different calculation than rebuilding it at 35. You have less runway. You are also, if you're lucky, less interested in performance and more interested in truth. The therapist asked us each in the first session what we had been most afraid to say out loud. My husband said he had been afraid that I had married a version of him that didn't exist, and that the real version, the one without the compelling need, the one who was just an ordinary 61-year-old man with some hearing loss and a lot of baggage, wasn't enough. I said I had been afraid that I had needed to be needed, and that some part of me had been relieved by his limitations because they gave me a clear and uncomplicated purpose, and that maybe his fear and my fear had found each other and made an arrangement neither of us had been fully honest about. The therapist let that sit in the room for a while. Then she said, "So now you know. What do you want to build instead?" That was 8 months ago. I won't tell you it has been easy. I won't give you a tidy resolution and wrap it in a bow because that would be dishonest. And I am done with dishonesty, including the comfortable kind. What I will tell you is this. I go to my sister's for Sunday dinner again. My husband comes with me sometimes, and sometimes he doesn't. And both of those things are now a choice rather than a sentence. I rejoined my book club. I kept up with the ASL, not because I have to, but because I find I like it, and because there is a woman in the class whose daughter is deaf and who has become unexpectedly a real friend. My husband finished the bookshelf he had apparently actually been building in the workshop, though it had taken him the better part of a year. It fits perfectly in the hallway. I put my teaching books on it, all the ones I had kept in boxes since I retired because there hadn't been a good place for them. We are different with each other now, more honest in a way that is sometimes uncomfortable, and more often clarifying. He tells me when he's struggling. I tell him when I feel like I'm disappearing into someone else's needs. We are both, I think, learning to take up the right amount of space. I am 63 years old. I have buried a husband and raised a daughter and stood in front of teenagers for 3 decades trying to convince them that words matter and that stories tell us who we are. I have learned that love at this age is not the lightning strike version. It is more like the choosing, again and again, with full knowledge of the cost. It is watering the roses, even when you're angry. It is sitting across from someone in a therapist's office and saying the true and frightening thing. I don't know how much time my husband and I have. I don't know how much time any of us have. What I know is that I would rather spend it in something real than in something comfortable and false. He still plants things in the garden sometimes without telling me. I find them there. A new herb, a different color of salvia, once a small lemon tree that had no business surviving a Tucson summer, but has so far proven us both wrong. I think that's who he is, under everything. Someone who tends to things quietly and hopes they take root. I am still deciding, every day, whether that is enough. Most days, I think it is.